A California killing spree that's captivated the world for decades. Now a group of sleuths claims to have solved the case of the infamous Zodiac Killer.
Now at 11, the new hunt for the Zodiac Killer. Tonight, Bay Area police may have found the key.
Deep into the night, a hush fell over the otherwise quiet hills of Northern California until the sudden flash of a gunshot shattered the calm. That moment marked the beginning of a chilling odyssey of horror and taunting messages that would come to define one of America's most enduring mysteries. For decades, the figure known only as the Zodiac Killer walked unseen among the Bay Area's streets, in basements and shadowed neighborhoods, leaving behind cryptic letters and a trail of bodies with no definitive end in sight. Now, after 50-plus years, forensic scientists claim they have finally unmasked him. What they found is terrifying. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The breakthrough began in a secluded laboratory where decades-old evidence was illuminated under modern tools that the original investigators could only dream of. Minute fragments of hair, specks of skin, dried blood beneath fingernails. All these inert relics stirred again when subjected to contemporary DNA analysis. Advances in genetic genealogy and low-copy forensic sequencing unlocked hidden leads. Within that mountain of untouched clues, a distinct genetic profile emerged, linking multiple crime scenes once held as isolated acts of cruelty. In parallel, the archives revealed a trove of physical artifacts tied to a suspect whose background, now exposed, fit the pattern of the Zodiac's rampage. Items long stashed in basements, shell casings mismatched to known suspects, and gun fragments hidden away, all pointed to a single man whose life had been hiding in plain sight. The identity the team uncovered belonged to Gary Francis Post, a former Air Force veteran and painter, long overlooked but now brought into the stark spotlight. Investigators found that Post had quietly dispersed weapons, ammunition, and relevant materials among acquaintances prior to his death, creating a trove of evidence that forensic scientists traced. At one crime scene, calibers and casings matched the hidden cache traced back to him, and DNA collected from a hiking mat once owned by Post and architectural samples connected him to the killer's profile. What started with a scrap of DNA from 20 years ago led to a full genetic blueprint, strong enough to tie the same hand to multiple murders across different counties. The horror lies not only in the fact that one man possibly committed all these crimes, but that he lived undetected, while public terror grew large. Forensic scientists delved into the killer's double life, discovering that Post had maintained a code of respectability, an everyday man by day, predator by night. He carried out attacks with methodical precision, striking couples in parked cars, a lone cab driver in the city leaving his signature, a circle with a crosshair. His letters, filled with misspellings and sadistic boasts, were not just taunts. They were clues, now viewed through the lens of his personality. The forensic profile revealed traits consistent with someone who viewed murder as sport, as communication, as power. His victims were not random. The selection, timing, arming, and control all pointed to a man comfortable in both camouflage and confrontation. His outward normalcy belied a chilling inner world where dominance, fear, and a twisted sense of immortality collided. At one crime scene, the killer forced a young couple onto their knees, stabbed them, and left a scared but surviving man to recount the horror. At another, he executed a taxi driver in downtown San Francisco, wiped down the cab, rifled through the victim's wallet, then called the police from the scene and announced his deed. The forensic trail covers everything from partial fingerprints to blood spatter patterns, but it is the DNA convergence across disparate crime scenes that sealed the linkage. Modern labs use trace evidence technology, the kind of tool that can process 50-year-old biological matter and align it with genealogical databases. Analysts reconstructed family trees, found distant cousins, and narrowed down to Post. Once the genetic line was established, investigators matched him to interpersonal history, proximity to crime sites, timeline consistencies, military service tied to weapons training, and his unusual behavior post-crime. The method was cold science meeting persistence, wrapping a name around the myth. What is terrifying is the sheer scale of the deception and patience. Here was a man who, after each murder, communicated with newspapers, taunted law enforcement, inserted cryptograms into civic headlines, and vanished seamlessly. His letters referenced collecting slaves for the afterlife and hinted at a kill count far higher than the confirmed 5. The forensic discovery now ties these statements to a calculated orchestrator who anticipated being pursued and thrived on the attention. The forensic files show he deliberately probed weaknesses in policing, exploited jurisdictional boundaries, and planted evidence across counties. With advances in analysis, scientists found that his weapon stash included multiple calibers matching those recovered at separate scenes, and that shell casing markings lined up when examined under high-resolution machining patterns. This forensic link is something law enforcement could not fully exploit in the 1960s and 70s. The timeline reveals the killer began in December 1968 with the shooting deaths of 2 teenagers. Over the following year, his signature escalated. First a shooting, then a stabbing, then a city cab hit, all within the same geographic zone. His communication escalated as well. He mailed letters to newspapers, diverted media attention, threatened bombings, and offered ciphers. None of these stops. The forensic scientists charted how his methods evolved. The weapons changed, the victims varied, but his core signature remained. A fluid predator, he adapted his hunting ground from lovers' lanes to a busy city street and left behind the same crosshair symbol. The forensic link shows the same person across both quiet rural settings and a chaotic urban environment. That adaptability highlights both his intelligence and his chameleon-like capability to remain undetected. Delving deeper into his background, forensic and investigative materials unearthed that Post had lived in the region, had access to multiple firearms, and had technical training. His life after the murders shows he continued moving, albeit keeping under the radar. The scientists discovered letters hidden away, references to the killer's location embedded as anagram clues in his name, and tools of his trade stashed in a former workspace. They found that he gave away weapons and bullets while retaining others, creating a messy trail, but enough for forensics to follow. One of the chilling aspects is that the killer apparently believed he would never be caught. Part of the terror is realizing how long he managed to evade capture while taunting the very agencies hunting him. The forensic implications extend beyond just identification. They speak to how one individual could commit a series of murders over time, cross county lines, leave sparse but consistent patterns, and yet remain unidentified for decades. The scientists uncovered that he used wife's clothes, disguises, payphones, and decoys, making their trail cold, but not frozen. With new tech, cold becomes warm. Biological traces from victims and overlap in shell casings provided what forensic pathologists call linkage evidence. The same gun, the same shooter, the same blood pattern profile. Meanwhile, latent prints and witness sketches that once went nowhere now merged with DNA genealogy trees. What seemed like scattered mysteries coalesced into a unified portrait of a killer. Another terrifying facet, psychological forensics reveal someone who believed in symbols, who understood media manipulation, who framed his killings as cosmic, almost ritualistic. The taunted authorities, challenged them publicly, made them part of his narrative. Through the letters, he sought recognition. Through the violence, he sought control. Forensic scientists found that his crime scenes contained more than killing, they contained messages. The cruciform symbol he drew was no afterthought, it was part of his signature. Investigators now see that he placed it deliberately at scenes on correspondence as a calling card. That he remained at liberty for years reveals his belief he was untouchable, a belief now shattered by the forensic chain they built. The effect of this scientific closure is unnerving. To know that one man, seemingly ordinary, stealthily operated across 2 decades, played a media game, taunted law enforcement, and walked among society while carrying out hellish deeds is chilling. The forensic trail shows he blended in and hid in plain sight, using tools of war, guns, knives, vehicles, but mixed them with the mundane, a workman's paintbrush, a house near the site, an Air Force past. It challenges our assumptions about the kind of person who commits such crimes and the notion that evil leaps out in obvious form. Sometimes evil is masked in casual anonymity. The scientists behind the breakthrough also painted a story of persistence. They examined evidence thought long dead. They revisited old case files, re-examined photographs, and digitized old shell casing markings. They applied cold case forensics techniques, environmental DNA recovery, stereoscopic imaging of bullet striations, gun linkage databases, and genealogical triangulation. Then they looked backward, how weapons passed through the suspect's hands, how his movements aligned with the cold case timeline, how witnesses' fleeting impressions matched one person's traits. That methodical unraveling pulled together the threads others had left for decades. In the horrors uncovered, the sheer number of victims may be far higher than previously confirmed. The forensic scientists noted that elements consistent with the killer's signature were found at more scenes than the 5 acknowledged murders. Shell casings with similar markings, early reports of shootings with the same modus operandi, and the killer's own letters claiming higher numbers all suggest a broader scale. The forensic mapping extended over a territory wider than originally believed, indicating the killer traveled widely and selected victims opportunistically rather than within a single narrow zone. That breadth of operation elevates the case from a localized spree to a strategic campaign of terror. Importantly, the disclosure does not include trial or conviction details. The scientists focus solely on forensics, the physical evidence, the DNA matches, the weapons analysis, and not the legal or judicial aftermath. The terror lies in what they found, not in what will happen next. What we are left to grapple with are the implications, the pathways by which a killer can evade capture, the limits of law enforcement of the era, and the way technology's march eventually brought him within reach. It reveals that science, when relentlessly applied, can whittle down even decades-old mysteries and confront nightmares thought consigned to legend. At one crime scene, the cab driver's body was lying in a pool of blood, a detour before the response arrived. Forensic scientists revisited the taxi's upholstery and discovered dried blood fibers matching the suspect's DNA line. At another scene, a young woman's scarf was preserved in an evidence envelope. Microscopic fibers matched a paint splatter sample taken from items found in the suspect's former residence. Each of these minute fragments built up a domino chain, tiny pieces of evidence linking disparate murders to one perpetrator. The forensic assemblage reminds us that evil leaves traces, no matter how careful. In reconstructing the timeline, the scientists saw that the killer cooled his activity after 1969, but they now believe he remained active in other regions under different names or unconnected cases. That possibility alone magnifies the terror. The forensic footprint stretches beyond what was once thought to be the end point. The tools of analysis show that after metadata of one series of killings may have been the beginning of another. The implication is stark. An individual with lethal capacity, media savvy, and anonymity can operate undetected across years and zones. Science has now started catching up. The identification of the killer also casts a long shadow over the many investigators who chased leads for years. Some forensic files were lost, some evidence contaminated, some agencies thwarted by interjurisdictional politics. The forensic breakthrough exposes a gap between 1960s policing and 21st century science. It shows that objects once dismissed as "will never get a match" now can bear the full weight of genetic profiling. It warns future investigators: preserve everything, believe in minutiae, and treat even inconclusive evidence as potential. The forensic scientists remind us the culprit was not found by a single big clue, but by layering dozens of small ones. Incomprehensible letters, shell casings, payphone records, DNA snippets, genealogy trees, weapon caches. The terror is not only in his deeds, but in how closeness to the brink escaped detection for so long. When the forensic report concluded that the same weapon type appeared in 3 different counties, using the same firing pin marticolor marking and cartridge indentation, that alone sent shivers through the community of cold case scientists. Then combining that with DNA recovered from a hiking mat once owned by the suspect created a chain strong enough to tie him conclusively. No mere speculation. Tangible scientific linkage. And yet the terrifying part is the wreckage of decades of victims, fear, unanswered questions, and the systems that failed to stop him. In the dark corners of history, this case will be remembered not merely for its brutality, but for how science finally turned the tide. The grandeur of the forensic achievement lies in turning myth into man, turning legend into lab result, turning decades of fear into a defined path of evidence. The implications are profound, that no matter how distant the past, the killers of yesterday can be caught by the tools of today. But it also forces us to confront the idea that unsolved terror may be hiding just beyond our reach, waiting for the forensic turn that finally reveals it. In that quiet laboratory under fluorescent light, forensic scientists held the chain of shells, the stained fabric, the genetic signature, and finally read the name of a man once lost to history. The chill that runs through that moment reaches us now. The individual behind the crosshair, the slayings, the letters, the fear, all identified. What remains is not relief, but the unshakable awareness that such evil existed undetected, that it thrived on anonymity and mockery of authority, and that for years it played its game while society slept. And now, armed with science, we face the reality of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history, and the testament that even the most elusive killer leaves a trace. The revelation of the Zodiac Killer's identity set in motion a flood of re-examinations, not of aftermath or reaction, but of what this discovery means about human nature, the limits of perception, and the terrifying intelligence that lurked behind each move the killer made. Forensic scientists, having pieced together decades of fragmented truth, now see a chilling architecture in how the murders were designed, how the killer manipulated both the physical evidence and the human psyche. The most disturbing realization came not from the DNA match itself, but from how every step of the Zodiac's campaign appeared deliberately planned to elude any forensic method that existed at the time. It was as if he anticipated the evolution of science and acted in ways to stay just ahead of it, concealing his identity not through luck, but through methodical awareness. Long before terms like forensic profiling or behavioral analysis were commonplace, the Zodiac constructed a psychological labyrinth for investigators. Each crime was not merely an act of violence, it was a message, a puzzle, an insult. The forensic analysis revealed patterns that extended beyond weapon type or method of attack. They uncovered a chilling mathematical consistency. Distances between crime scenes formed geometric patterns when plotted, the kind that suggested mapping or military-grade triangulation. This was no coincidence. When scientists reconstructed the spatial distribution of the murders, they found alignments corresponding to rural areas he once patrolled during his Air Force tenure. Every location represented not randomness but control. It was a calculated geography of death, where every victim served as a marker in a personal cipher. The use of letters, ciphers, and cryptograms adds another layer to the forensic understanding of his mind. Handwriting experts, working alongside linguistic analysts, detected traits of compulsion and ego. The loops and slants of his handwriting showed an obsession with dominance, a refusal to conform even to grammatical structure. Forensic linguistics identified recurring substitutions and errors that weren't accidental. They were consistent with coded masking. Scientists compared his letters with the diaries and notes recovered from his possessions, finding matching pressure points and microscopic ink compositions. That convergence confirmed authenticity and connected the killer's communicative taunts directly to his daily life, merging the myth of the Zodiac with the real man behind the pen. The deeper forensic dive into the killer's methods revealed a mastery of avoidance. At the time of his crimes, fingerprinting was the cornerstone of identification. He evaded it not by luck, but by using unique adhesives, gloves, and sometimes applying a thin layer of oil or even glue to his fingertips. This revelation, confirmed through chemical residue analysis on envelopes and weapon grips, underscored his awareness of law enforcement tactics. He left behind partial prints intentionally smudged, creating false leads. Forensic chemists later discovered that some of those prints had been overlaid with powdered graphite, a trick to mimic the residue left by printing ink. The knowledge required to stage such illusions could not have been random. It came from someone who studied police practices, someone who reveled in their limitations. Forensic psychologists studying the killer's behavior recognized a blend of narcissism and strategic patience rarely seen in serial murderers. Most killers act impulsively, but the Zodiac's actions displayed delayed gratification. He thrived on the anticipation of discovery, stretching out his control by feeding information in calculated doses. Scientists examining his communication timeline noticed a distinct rhythm. Letters arriving just after public frustration peaked, like a puppeteer tightening the strings of fear. His crimes were conversations, each murder a statement punctuated by a letter. The terrifying implication is that for him, the murders were only half the performance. The true satisfaction came from orchestrating societal panic. When forensic teams reconstructed the ballistic evidence with modern 3D scanning, they found alignment between bullets recovered from different victims decades apart. The microstriations on the casings matched perfectly, proving that a single weapon had been used across multiple attacks. But what truly unsettled the scientists was the realization that he intentionally used older ammunition to confuse investigators. The rounds he fired were often out of production by the time of the attacks, making them harder to trace. This detail alone painted a portrait of a killer who planned his arsenal with the same meticulousness as his riddles. His precision blurred the boundary between intellect and monstrosity. Further evidence showed that the killer made deliberate efforts to control the crime scenes. Forensic pathologists found peculiar consistencies in how he positioned bodies and objects after the killings. Victims were placed in orientations that corresponded to compass points or to symbols later referenced in his letters. These ritualistic arrangements suggested not randomness but ritual, a coded message that only he understood. Scientists examining the scenes decades later reconstructed these configurations through digital modeling, revealing patterns that could correspond to zodiacal constellations. It became clear that his obsession with the name Zodiac was more than an alias. It was the framework of his crimes. Each murder fit into an astrological pattern, creating a chilling fusion of astronomy, symbolism, and murder. DNA analysis also led forensic genealogists to uncover more about the killer's ancestry and genetic health. His genome indicated elevated markers associated with certain neurological conditions that can intensify aggression and reduce empathy. This does not explain his crimes, but it suggests a biological predisposition that, combined with his environmental background and psychological makeup, created a lethal storm. The forensic community now views him not simply as a criminal, but as a case study in how biology, intelligence, and ideology can merge into pathological evil. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from forensic document analysis. Using hyperspectral imaging on the killer's old letters, scientists uncovered invisible layers of writing, messages that had been erased or overwritten. Some of these hidden notes contained partial phrases, coordinates, and numerical sequences that, when mapped, corresponded to unsearched areas of California wilderness. Whether these were decoys or genuine allusions to undiscovered crimes remains uncertain, but the implication is haunting. The Zodiac story may not be fully told, even with his identity known. Forensics opened a door, but beyond it lies an abyss of unanswered questions. One striking revelation emerged from forensic digital reconstruction of the killer's communication pattern. By analyzing postmarks, letter spacing, and references to current events within his writings, scientists determined that he followed news coverage closely, tailoring his messages to maximize public terror. He inserted linguistic hooks, phrases mirroring headlines, to ensure recognition. Forensic sociologists studying the letters concluded that the Zodiac used mass media as his weapon, understanding how collective psychology amplifies fear. He was among the first criminals to weaponize public communication, decades before social networks existed. The scientists realized they weren't merely confronting a murderer, they were confronting a proto-architect of psychological warfare. The identification of the killer's background revealed a deeper layer of dread. His military service meant he had training in codes, mapping, and survival. Forensic ballistic experts confirmed he had modified his weapons himself, filing down trigger guards and reshaping barrel linings to alter ballistic signatures. This craftsmanship explained why early investigators struggled to match bullets between crimes. He treated his weapons as instruments of art, each modification both a practical adjustment and a symbolic act of ownership over death. Scientists studying his tools found that he had engraved minute marks inside his gun frames, personal symbols invisible to anyone but himself. Even his instruments bore his twisted identity. While the DNA revelation pinned him as the likely culprit, forensic pathologists also uncovered chilling evidence in his living environment. Old paint cans in his garage, when analyzed, contained trace amounts of blood proteins and lead residue matching bullets found at crime scenes. These discoveries, layered over his personal journals filled with fragmented words and geometric sketches, painted an image of a man who rehearsed his crimes like compositions. The implication is that his killings were never spontaneous. They were performances of power carefully orchestrated in private spaces long before the first trigger was pulled. Scientists also delved into his possible motivations, using forensic psychiatry to map his behavioral trajectory. They found evidence of deep resentment toward authority, women, and perceived social elites. His letters repeatedly mocked the police, reflecting not just anger but contempt. His use of ciphers signaled a craving for superiority, a need to remind the world that he was always one step ahead. Forensic timeline analysis showed that each communication coincided with significant personal upheavals, suggesting he used murder as an emotional reset. The terrifying insight from these findings is that his killings were not random expressions of rage, but carefully timed acts of psychological renewal. One of the more haunting elements uncovered through forensic voice analysis came from a recorded phone call made by the killer to police after one of his murders. Advances in audio enhancement allowed scientists to isolate background sounds once obscured by noise. What they found was horrifying: faint rhythmic tapping, consistent with the mechanical hum of a vehicle used in his earlier crimes. This small detail confirmed that he carried out post-murder calls using the same car, linking his communication directly to his operational patterns. It reinforced that he viewed each act, murder, message, mockery, as part of a continuous ritual, not discrete events. The phone call, once dismissed as bravado, now revealed itself as evidence of an unbroken sequence of domination. As scientists delved further, they began to see a symbolic logic underlying his choice of victims. Forensic criminologists studying his targets discovered correlations between the victims' birthdays and the astrological signs referenced in his letters. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. It appeared the Zodiac saw his victims as emblems within a larger cosmological design. This finding reframed the entire case. What seemed like arbitrary slaughter was instead the enactment of a delusional ideology, where he viewed himself as orchestrating cosmic balance through death. The implications are terrifying not because of superstition, but because of how coldly rational he made his madness appear. Another forensic triumph came from revisiting the paper stock of his letters. Scientists discovered that several pages came from rare batches produced for military correspondence. Chemical tracers in the paper fibers matched samples distributed to bases near where Post had served. This connection between material and suspect added another thread of certainty, demonstrating how even the mundane, the texture of paper, can betray a killer decades later. What this illustrates is that science, though slow, is relentless, and evil, no matter how cautious, cannot anticipate every trace it leaves behind. The laboratory where the identification was confirmed became a modern crime cathedral. The scientists described a palpable silence when the genetic sequence aligned perfectly with the historical profile. They were not law enforcement officers seeking glory. They were historians of horror uncovering a truth buried in data. The terror they felt was intellectual. The realization that this man, long dead, had once controlled entire cities with fear, and now his secrets unfolded cell by cell beneath a microscope. Each data point was another ghost speaking through science. As they pieced together the killer's timeline, they realized that his years of silence were not retirement, but evolution. Forensic data from other unsolved cases hinted that he may have changed methods, adopting new signatures that evaded detection under different aliases. His attention to ritual never faded. It merely shifted forms. Though direct proof remains elusive, the forensic evidence implies continuity of behavior far beyond the accepted timeline. It challenges the notion that the Zodiac killings ever truly stopped. The implications of this discovery extend to the philosophy of criminal detection itself. The Zodiac case, once a cautionary tale of investigative failure, has transformed into a study of perseverance. Forensic scientists demonstrated that the passage of time no longer protects the guilty. Every hair follicle, every scrap of metal, every faint chemical trace carries its own record of truth, waiting for technology to catch up. This truth is as humbling as it is frightening. The world is saturated with invisible evidence, and those who commit atrocities may never truly vanish, even into death. Equally disturbing is what the case reveals about human fascination with darkness. The Zodiac's ability to captivate public imagination for half a century speaks to an uncomfortable truth. His story thrived because he understood attention. He created a mythology around his crimes, turning murder into spectacle. Forensic scientists, by unmasking him, dismantled that mythology, revealing the small, fragile human being beneath the monstrous legend. Yet even that act of demystification is shadowed by dread, because it shows how charisma and cruelty can merge in ways society struggles to recognize. The laboratory report closes with a haunting observation. The killer's biological material, preserved for decades, now serves as the silent testimony he tried to erase. It's a paradox of science. The same human body that commits unspeakable acts carries within it the code of its own undoing. Every cell, every atom remembers. The identification of the Zodiac Killer, therefore, is not merely a conclusion but a mirror held up to the capacity of science to reveal what the human heart tries to hide. And so, as forensic scientists seal their final analyses, they have done more than solve a mystery. They have illuminated the anatomy of terror itself. They have shown how intellect, obsession, and evil can fuse into one being, and how, despite decades of fear and legend, the truth can still rise from dust and data. What they found is terrifying not only because of who the Zodiac was, but because of what he represents. The potential for darkness in the ordinary. The cunning of intellect turned to destruction, and the enduring power of science to drag that darkness into light, cell by cell, until even the most elusive killer can no longer hide in the shadows of history. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the Zodiac Killer finally being identified? What do you expect revealed? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.